Welcome to the review video for our quiz, and I wish I could say this is an easy quiz, but it is actually a little bit harder quiz. I hope you are watching this video not 2 minutes before class. But let me start by telling you about the quiz, and then we will go over some review things that you will need to know for the quiz, all right? The first section is a matching section, and it is matching different acts, as in English laws that were passed, with what they were. Then there's a true and false section, which I have nicely italicized the part of the question that you'll need to question, but definitely make sure you read them very carefully because I like to try to be kind of tricky, all right? And then on the back page there is a complete section of short answer, and so that is probably the most difficult part of this quiz, all right? So let's spend some time going over some things, and we are covering quite a bit of section because basically this is from the midterm until not quite everything we went over last week, but quite a bit of it, all right? We were talking about the reasons that we declared independence, and we mentioned that England began doing several different things that caused us to want to declare independence. We mentioned a term, laissez-faire, which means hands-off policy, and they had pretty much taken a hands-off policy in regards to the colonies for a long time, and they kind of left us alone, and they stopped doing that, and that caused a little bit of problems with us. England at the time operated under an economic system called mercantilism, and mercantilism is that colonies exist for the good of the mother country, and that a nation's wealth is based on the amount of gold and silver the government has. And of course, we know that a wealth of nations is not based on how much money the government has, but how prosperous the people are. And of course, that is the economic system of America today. We mentioned that England passed several different acts that caused a lot of problems in the colonies. We mentioned the Currency Act of 1764. By the way, don't worry, I won't make you know the years, all right? But it prohibited the colonial governors from issuing paper money, and also prohibited them from paying British merchants with colonial currency, and so stopped them from making their own money. We mentioned the Stamp Act, which of course was one of the most well-known and hated acts of England, and this required basically the colonists to have to buy stamps for just about everything. Newspapers, any kind of document that was published, they would have to buy stamps for it, all right? We mentioned the Quartering Act, which allowed British soldiers to be quartered, first of all, in unoccupied buildings, and then later on in their actual homes. Then we mentioned the Declaratory Act, which basically stated that Parliament had the power to pass laws and make the colonists do basically whatever they wanted, all right? And of course, that was the main one of the main crux of our independence. We said we don't vote for Parliament, so they really shouldn't have any power over us. We mentioned the Townshend Acts, which put taxes on imported goods, and also established a customs board that was located in Boston and collected taxes there. Of course, we mentioned as a result of the crackdown, especially in Boston, there were soldiers that were stationed around Boston, and there was an event called the Boston Massacre, which happened in 1770, in which some British soldiers killed a few of the colonists. And we mentioned, of course, that John Adams, one of our founding fathers, and Josiah Quincy defended those soldiers in court. And we mentioned the fact that unlike England, we actually believe that people ought to have at least a fair trial, and they allowed for that. We mentioned that in order to kind of combat some of the things that were happening that Britain was doing to us, Sam Adams, a nephew of John Adams, formed the Committee of Correspondence, which basically kept people up to date with what Britain was doing to us, and also giving us legal ideas of why they were not allowed to do what they were doing. We mentioned one of the other things that the colonists didn't like was the fact that the Parliament passed a law allowing the British East India Company to ship tea directly to the colonies. And of course, this helped them avoid taxes that were in England. And it also allowed them to sell tea at a cheaper rate than some of the tea that the colonists were smuggling in. And what was the colonists' reaction to that? They boycotted the tea anyway. And of course, later on, they had the Boston Tea Party, which we talked about. We mentioned at this time that Baptists were very much in the fight against the improper government that England was putting forth. And they formed a group that were mainly Baptists. They were called the North Carolina Regulators. And they were basically a group that was formed to stand up against unjust government, unjust taxes. During this time, some of the royal governors were embezzling tax funds and things like that. And the regulators were formed at that time to help fight against that. We mentioned that there were many Baptist preachers that went to jail as a result of preaching the gospel. Of course, Baptists were considered a dissentant group and weren't actually allowed to preach in many cases. And we mentioned two specific Baptist preachers, Joseph Craig and Aaron Bledsoe. And of course, we mentioned that they went to jail for the crime of preaching the gospel of the Son of God. And we mentioned that founding father Patrick Henry rode 60 miles by horseback in order to defend them in a court of law. And by the way, got them acquitted at that time. We also mentioned another famous Baptist preacher that went to prison several different times. Swearin' Jack Waller went to 4 different Virginia jailhouses during his time of preaching. Preached in jail while he was being in prison. And he is the one that made the quote, "Wolves are not persecuted by sheep, and no sheep ever destroyed wolves." And of course, he said that when they tried to call him a wolf in sheep's clothing. We mentioned other things that England was doing at the time. We mentioned the Intolerable Acts, and these were a series of acts passed in 1774 that were designed to punish Massachusetts itself. And after the passing of the Intolerable Acts, that is when we had the Boston Tea Party. And that caused even more problems for us. During this period of time of 1774, we had the First Continental Congress, which met, and they passed something, and you don't want to miss this. This is one that is often missed on these kind of quizzes, the Declaration and Resolves. And that was a document that we passed that basically said, look, we are British citizens, and the British Constitution allows American colonists who are British citizens to have the same right as British citizens living in Britain. And that is the Declaration of Resolves. Of course, that didn't go very far with the king, but we did pass that. In 1775, there were calls for independence. Patrick Henry was one of those men that made that call. He made that statement, "I know not what other course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death." During 1775, of course, we had the first shot fired in the War for Independence, and that was at Lexington, Concord, and we call that the shot heard around the world. We're not sure who fired the first shot, but it was the shot that basically started the Revolutionary War. Even after the shot that was heard around the world, we still did try one last ditch effort to help not go to war, and we passed what was called the Olive Branch Petition, and that was kind of one last ditch effort in which we tried to say, look, if the king will sit down and stop doing these things to us, we want to be English citizens. We want to be submissive to the crown. And of course, the king responded not by looking at our grievances, but he issued the Prohibitory Act. And that act basically barred all trade with the colonies and removed us from the protection of the king. And so in some ways, you might say the king walked away from us. We didn't walk away from the king. He's the one that says, basically, you're not my people anymore. and so he led us out there. Also, that allowed for other foreign invaders, and of course, the King of England hired Prussian mercenaries, all right, and Hessians to invade us. During this period of time, there was a pamphlet written by Thomas Paine called Common Sense, and that really is one of the documents that pushed the idea of independence. On May 4th, 1776, 2 months before we declared independence as a nation, the little Baptist colony of Rhode Island declared independence from England. And so the Baptist colony separated 2 months before the rest of the country did. And of course, we know that on July 4th, 1776, the Declaration of Independence was signed. Now, don't get that confused with the Constitution, which was signed quite a bit later, all right? Declaration of Independence, signed on July 4th, 1776. Of course, we talked about the war, and it was a very difficult war. In the very beginning battles, we lost several different battles, but God did allow for some foreign help. Of course, the French came to our aid, and more specifically, there was a young Frenchman who became a close friend to George Washington and also one of our generals, Marquis de Lafayette, and he was a great help to us, helped us win the war. We mentioned several miracles that happened during the war. Of course, we mentioned the New York campaign, in which Washington's army was stuck on Long Island, New York, would have been caught, and that would have effectively ended the war for us at that point in time. But God brought a great fog to come in, and we were able to evacuate our army across the Delaware River. And just as the fog lifted, the last boat of colonist soldiers, Patriot soldiers, were being taken off of Long Island. And of course, according to legend, George Washington waited until the last boat to leave. George Washington did later cross the Delaware, again, in a surprise attack. And it was definitely a surprise because it happened on Christmas night of 1776. During that attack, and that was the Battle of Trenton, we were able to capture 1,000 Hessian troops and really break a lot of the back of the foreign mercenaries that were hired against us. We mentioned in 1777, 1778, a very harsh winter in which Washington's army stayed at Valley Forge, and known as one of the very difficult winters during that time. Of course, the Battle of Yorktown is really what ended the war for us effectively, and that was where General Cornwallis had to surrender his 8,000-man army, and pretty much that was the end of the war. We signed the Treaty of Paris in September of 1783, and that is the treaty that ended the war for us. All right, I believe that is all that we had. I did not go over a lot of the stuff with the Declaration of Independence or some of the stuff we've talked about with George Washington. That'll probably be on the follow-up quiz, the next quiz. But anyway, study very hard, and I'll see you on Thursday.